Good evening. My name is Komal, and I'm with Sarmaya Arts Foundation. And on behalf of our organization, I'm actually very happy to see a large crowd today, this Friday. I would like to now introduce our first speaker for today. Dr. Ritu Sethi is editor of Global International Journal of Intangible Cultural Heritage. In addition, she oversees the journal's Asia Encyclopaedia, that is globally recognized as the leading repository of online knowledge on the traditional arts, crafts, textiles, and its practitioners across South Asia. She is the founder-trustee of the Craft Revival Trust. Her research interests examine aspects of the visual and material culture of the arts, textiles, and the handmade in pre- and post-colonial India, and its links to modern and contemporary. She has authored and edited several publications. She's currently serving on several advisory boards on culture and policy in India, Japan, and Argentina. Dr. Sethi.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here in this august audience. So let me start. This is easy. With an appreciation that has been shaped by one of the world's most sophisticated textile cultures, cloth in India remains one of the most visible of influences over contemporary life. Rooted in their many millennia-old civilizational links, their making and use having shaped the social, political, religious, and aesthetic life of the subcontinent. Coveted the world over, they weighed in on trade and commerce. Yet, from the mid-1700s, these traditions entered a long decline, as from a 25% share of world industrial output, India's share by 1900 had fallen to only 2%. India had become an importer of finished goods and an exporter of raw material. In the textile ecologies, from spinning, weaving, and other specialized textile processes that India was famed for, the production was to be virtually decimated, misappropriated, and almost lost in the culture that had conceived it. My paper today casts a narrow lens on this huge ecology by engaging with just a single subset of textile making, hand block printing. And given the time available, my approach has been narrowed further to a timeline. For while the storied history of hand-painted and block-printed textiles can be traced back to the Indus civilization and the discovery of fragments of cotton-dyed madder and the priest king whose stir-foil cloak could have been block-printed. My account commences in 1700s and continues over a period of more than 3 centuries, 323 years to be exact, examining shifts and continuities to frame the bare bones of this layered, complex landscape on its ongoing journey to revival and regeneration in the India of today. In Britain, at the start of the 1700s, its negative trade balance and its consequent impact on domestic textile production was being largely blamed on the rage for the wildly fashionable block printed and painted cotton textiles that were imported in from India. It was felt that this import was the cause of, and I quote, excessive increase to the poor, and if not effectually prevented, may be the utter ruin and destruction of many thousands. In response, the British Parliament legislated protectionist laws that safeguarded English manufactures. The first Calico Act of 1701 banned the import of all calicos from India. The second Calico Act of 1721 was draconian, as it prohibited not just the import and sale of painted, printed, dyed, or stained calicos from India, but banned its very wearing or use in any manner in Britain, whether it be apparel, household stuff, furniture, or otherwise. This embargo ensured that the printed textile industry in Britain no longer faced any competition from India. This period was also very well used, as it provided Britain with much needed time for import substitution that focused on the imitation and copying of block printed and painted textiles from India, and the parallel development of mechanization of spinning, weaving, dyeing, and printing techniques that seeded the Industrial Revolution. By 1736, machines that replicated hand block printing processes were being unveiled. Progressive improvements continued, and by 1752, the engraved copper plate printing technology replicated designs with greater accuracy. But it was the 1783 rotary cylinder machine that altered forever the mechanized printing landscape, as it allowed for the continuous printing of cloth. Ongoing innovations and refinements led to further gains, with continuous printing of 10,000 to 12,000 yards in a single 10-hour shift. The technology came to have widespread commercial acceptance, as it was especially suited to the production of shawls and saris for the Indian market, as it allowed for printing wide borders across the length and an added mechanism for printing end borders or crossbars used in the sari end piece, the pallu. This technology needed endless new markets and new customers to absorb this seemingly limitless production capacity. These were all grievous blows to Indian block printers and painters who worked in a dispersed and unprotected polity that gave them no voice or recourse to either economic, commercial, or political tools with which to respond to this focused and determined onslaught. The result of the British trade embargo, with export demand abruptly cut off, coupled with imports of machine-printed copies that replicated appropriated patterns at far lower cost, was that across India, the block print and painted textile industry suffered irreparable damage. Politics played an equally important role in the reversal of fortunes, as trade, economic development, and power were inextricably linked to the changing balance on the subcontinent. As a British East India Company that had come into India in the 17th century had, by the 1700s, moved well beyond commerce and into territorial and political enlargement. But the turning point was in 1757, when the company's military victories at Plassey gave it control of governance and revenue collection, eventually across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was followed by a policy of continuing encroachments into successor states of the Mughal Empire and the independent fiefdoms through annexations, or through subsidiary alliances that established the company's dominion across large swaths of the subcontinent. As a monopoly trading company, the British Parliament's 1793 Charter Act and others that followed bestowed on them the powers to rule India and extended the company's enormous commercial privileges. Armed now with political authority and military clout, the subcontinent, with its substantial resources, along with its polity, were now formally controlled by the mercantilist and trade interests of the company. That in turn ensured a huge percentage of its income to an increasingly expansionist Britain. A corollary of this domination was a monopsonist leveraging of economic and commercial power by the company that gave it the tools to control the production, sale, and trade of raw materials and finished products in its territory, in addition to swamping the Indian market with mass-produced textile products of Britain's Industrial Revolution. First set in place in Bengal and Odisha, this monopsonist system served as a template across the expanding territorial dominion of the company as it leveraged its political domination to create trade and manufacturing conditions in which it was the only buyer. Scholars of economic history have defined this power in no uncertain terms as coercive and coercion-based. And I quote, "The company subjected suppliers and block printing artisans to complete domination, imposing on them unilaterally determined terms and conditions which significantly cut into their margin of profit. Since the company's textile requirements took precedence over everyone else's, until such time as the suppliers had met their contractual obligations towards the company, the terms offered were extraordinarily poor. In Britain, the Calico Act was repealed in 1774. It had by then served its purpose, and distressingly, the very reason for the implementation of the Act was now the cause, and I quote again, is excessive increase to the poor, the utter ruin and destruction of many thousands. Being true now of the textile makers and ancillary worker families in India. The textile producing centers, their supply chains, and ecosystems were really one of the earliest subjects of the wider colonization that was to follow. By 1832, an astonishing over 200 million yards of printed or dyed mill cottons left Britain for international markets. By 1850, just 18 years later, its mills were producing 347 million yards, with an even larger proportion being exported to foreign markets. Their peculiarities were taken into account as products were adapted to the taste of dependent nations. Britain had become the world's most important cotton textile producer, dominating world export markets. There were other complementary factors at play, with transversal intersects of hard-headed commercial and trade priorities that further advantaged Britain. These could broadly be considered under three main heads. The first being what would eventually become a long-running series of global exhibitions that were held in the seat of imperial power. The commercial objectives of the exhibition were succinctly stated in the very first of the exhibitions in 1851, and I quote, "Since by the powers of our mechanical inventions, we are able to import cotton from India, manufacture it and re-export it at such a price as to undersell by 75% the half-naked rice-eating producer of the finest muslin, it is as much our duty as our interest to assist in stimulating the growth of cotton." The first exhibition in 1851, labeled "The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations," showcased objects from cultural artifacts, raw materials to contemporary manufacturing. The official catalogue described the huge range of British manufactured, printed calico and chintzes as, and I quote, "At first the imitation of those of India, they are now produced in patterns of an indefinite variety every year, machine printed on cotton, silk, velvet, wool, and mixed fabrics, and purposed for use as clothing, as drapery, wall hangings, and curtains, bed furnishings, window blinds, and other manner of things." This unlevel playing field that already advantaged Britain was tilted further as these exhibitions provided easy access to a vast emporium of goods and designs. In the India section, for instance, a wide variety of hand-block prints were on display and described as being admirable for their taste and elegance. Commercial objectives were furthered as the exhibition provided British manufacturers with abundant access to sources of cheap raw materials, to power the needs of its industrialized economy and fuel its manufactures. The textile exhibits included raw materials from seeds to varieties of cotton, wool, silk, to dyes, colorants, and pigments. The details of the processes and the tools on display of specialized textile processes provided inspiration for mechanization, while finished handmade products were accessible for imitation and mass production and eventual re-export to its colonies and dependencies. The access would, in today's context, be likened to the opening up of industrial secrets to an all powerful competitor. The Great Exhibition set in place the groundwork for subsequent exhibitions, and as in 1851, the display of Indian manufactures and raw materials continued to play a dominant role as a balance of trade moved inexorably to favor Britain. The second manifestation of hard headed business priorities adjunct to the exhibitions was the beginnings of a wide and systematized collection of advantageous knowledge from across India that would facilitate the building of British manufacturing and design sensibility. A whole host of publications ensued, but here I reference the hugely influential Grammar of Ornaments by Owen Jones, himself one of the organizers of the 1851 exhibition. First published in 1856, all these years later, it is still in print. This extravagantly produced folio highlighted selected principles from Egypt, Persia to India that, as Owen stated, and I quote, "We should regard as our inheritance all the successful labors of the past." In his push to improve the quality of British craftsmanship, Owens elaborated, and I quote again, "My chief aim to place side by side types of such styles as might best serve as landmarks and aids to students in their outward path." The third was the structured setting up of public collections and museums that hosted objects that were beneficial for furthering British industry's manufacturing and design sensibilities. A direct corollary of the 1851 exhibition was the acquiring of modern manufacturers from other countries. These were housed in the newly set up Museum of Manufactures in 1852, the collection being enhanced by generous gifts from the East India Company's India Collection. The museum was renamed the South Kensington Museum and was eventually baptized the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1857. The objects from the 1851 exhibitions and the subsequent ones also fed the British Museum, the National History Museum, the Royal Botanical Garden at Kew. This pattern of collecting useful knowledge to set a template for all future exhibitions and also set in place an aggressive policy of acquisition from India and Britain's other colonies. So these are just some pictures that were of objects that were collected from 1851, of block prints. In the aftermath of the 1857 Indian Rebellion, the British Crown took over the jurisdiction of the Indian subcontinent from the East India Company. Its large private army, its bureaucracy to its trade interests passed into its control. The system set in place by the company in its pursuit and organization of its trade interests and the smooth flow of business laid the groundwork for the future, with its monopsonist commercial interests now within the imperial framework. Its deep-rooted influence being underscored more than 5 decades later in 1913, when Sir T.H. Holland, Director of the Geological Survey of India, assigned the continuing success of British rule in India to this foundational foresight, stating, and I quote, "As this was because the British occupation was that of a trading company, of which the present government of India is a lineal descendant." While documentation of processes, tools, and designs had begun in the early 18th century, from the 1860s onwards, the systematic collection of valuable knowledge across the territory became even more rigorous. Detailed methodologies formulated that meticulously recorded India's art manufactures, production techniques to itemized economic products, and other mappings continued tirelessly. In the textile ecosystem, one example exemplifies the thorough market research and systematic copying and product substitution by the insatiable mills of Manchester and Lancashire. In 1866, John Forbes Watson, director of the East India Company's India Museum, was appointed reporter of the products of India and was tasked with identifying and cataloguing Indian textile products, the outcome being the Textile Manufactures of India. Describing it as, and I quote, portable trade museum, the 18-volume set contained 700 textile samples measuring about 35 into 20 centimeters each. These samples were classified by where the textile was made, regional consumer preferences on wearing or use, its price, size, and weight. Of the 20 sets produced, 13 were distributed to textile manufacturing districts in Britain, its chambers of commerce, and art schools. More than 100 samples were of hand block prints. The selection was not meant to be representative of all the textiles produced, but rather those that Forbes Watson felt suitable for British manufacturers to copy, stating in the publication, and I quote, for an individual or nation to become a customer, we endeavor to make the articles which we know to be liked and needed, and those we offer for sale. Noting further that the sample, and I quotation starts, show what the people of India affect and deem suitable in the way of textile fabrics. And if the supply of these is to come from Britain, they must be imitated there. What is wanted and what is to be copied to meet that want is thus accessible in these museums. He added, India is in a position to become a magnificent consumer, for to clothe but a mere percentage of such a vast population would double the looms of Lancashire. A rare first-hand glimpse of the substitution of textile products and its impact on the maker printing community, who were at the receiving end of colonial policy, is in 1897, when Edgar Thurston, director of the Madras Museum, wrote in his tour notes, the Kalahasti cotton fabric painters whom I recently interviewed, were at first afraid of me, suspecting that I was a commercial traveler on behalf of some firm, and had come among them with the base objective of annexing their patterns for reproduction by machinery. They complained bitterly that British manufacturers are now copying patterns which they and the Masolipatnam block printers had turned out for many generations, and drew my attention to an imported cloth with a debased Indian pink device. A piece with a similar device made with vegetable dyes used to cost rupees 4, whereas the British imitation, being machine made with mineral dyes, can be sold at rupees 2. He stated further, the demand for them has greatly declined in recent years owing to the importation of British printed cloth, which are used as cheap substitutes for them, and the workmen, who are very skillful artisans, cannot even earn 4 annas a day. It was against the backdrop of governance and its mercantilist objectives that by the end of the 19th century, India's huge and captive market had truly become a magnificent customer of imported goods of British manufacture. In the area of block printed and printed textile, it had a devastating effect, as this was achieved at the cost of the artist makers and the cultural loss of a tradition. By the early years of the 20th century, the crumbling of empire had been set in motion as a nationalist movement was gathering momentum. Today, it is hard to imagine the India of 1947 as the hard reality of empty coffers and a deindustrialized economy was faced by freedom fighters now turned administrators. The partition of the country had brought in its wake a large migration of population, and there were block printers, block makers, and other artisans among the 7 to 10 million who crossed over to one or the other side of the newly created borders. As the new polity settled into administration, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in 1952 appointed two remarkable women to lead this cultural ecosphere. Under the aegis of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay was chair of the All India Handicrafts Board and Pupul Jekar, chair of the All India Handloom Board. Both recognized that the textiles, the arts, and the crafts were not only an invaluable cultural asset, but equally an economic force. Chattopadhyay worked with the Handicrafts Board for 15 years till 1967. Her prolific career continued thereafter, while Jekar had a role that expanded exponentially and continued till 1990. Their foundational work created patterns of pan-Indian impact and continue to do so in the institutions and frameworks they were instrumental in setting up. Our first details on block printing post-independence are from the 1961 Census of India monographs and corresponding reports from the All India Handicrafts Board. These studies from once famed centers like Jaipur, Sanganer, Berungar, the twin villages of Javad and Tarapur, from Mathura and Vrindavan to Srikalahasti and Masoli Patnam and others, revealed the very fractured situation. Customers were few, and age-old links of maker communities were, what can I say, endangered, lost, decimated. But much has to be said of the resilience and a real resistance of these remarkable makers. For while we have reports from storied traditions, there were also the quiet, unmarked, and unnoticed village traditions, where cultural markers and identities remained closely linked to textiles, to clothes worn and choices made of patterns and colors, choices determined by caste, faith, social standing, economic status, and the festive and the ritual calendar. So, in small villages where there was access to water, there were a few tables where skilled masters printed for the agriculturalists, for the tribal communities, and the pastoralists. Sales were made either in the village itself or in the hath or bazaar that popped up weekly. And one such tradition and one such printer who went on to become a great and well-known master, Ismail Suleiman Khatri, eventually settled in Bagh, Madhya Pradesh, said it all when he spoke about his tribal clients. And he said of them, what a sense of beauty and continuity they had. And that is what pains me, for this sentence opened up the many layered complexities. And I quote a 1903 document that stated, "It might almost be said of the crafts of India that none are so universal and frequently employed as that of the rangres or dyer and the chippigar or calico printer." And that set me researching the volumes of the 1908 Imperial Gazetteer, which mapped the industrial arts of towns and villages to find over 120 places where block printing was practiced. And that is what really saddened me, was how much we have lost. On the one hand, of these skills, oral traditions, of techniques, of color making, and on the other hand, of the prints and patterns, an entire oral history which were markers of community identity and custom. But the tide was to turn slowly, and it is a testament to the remarkable tenacity of printing masters who withstood these winds to adapt again with the times. For it was the 1960s, and the counterculture movement was at its height. It brought in travelers, and not just those on the hippie trail. They came to the beaches, the mountains to meditation and yoga. They sampled the cuisine and wore handmade and block printed. And with them came the Beatles and further led the India mania and the export boom. They brought business to block printers and led to rapid developments. New products, new patterns, new color palettes combined with fast deliveries for new markets. The printing process moved from low tables favored earlier, with printers seated on the ground, to high tables for stand-up printing that were wider and extended the length of karkhanas and were well suited for home furnishings. Direct block printing with mineral dyes that required no mordants or resist or repeated washings and processing were now favored for their speed. The new markets included established stores like Bloomingdale's, Liberties of London, startups like Habitat, Monsoon, and others. But by the late 70s came the bust, as the overseas craze turned to the next new thing. Production capacities that had been expanded were now underutilized, and cheaper screen prints that had been introduced to ensure swift deliveries had taken over the slower-paced block printing processes. These were difficult adjustments to be made. Many left the trade, but out of the bust emerged long-term committed players from Japan to Canada, unwavering in their steady recognition of the value of being green before green. The Indian market too was developing for fashion, clothes, and home textiles. And these extended from the central cottage industries, Fab India, Anokhi, the late Suraya Hassan in Hyderabad, and other entrepreneurs across the country, demonstrating that it was possible to run successful craft-based businesses, sustaining a steady demand for craft skills year after year. In the 1980s, there were other influences too, with government being a leading player. And the 80s saw a decade-long series of engagements to spark business interests and bring to the world a greater understanding of the culture of India. And this was to shape textile futures. Labeled the Festival of India, its advisory committee was chaired by Pupil Jekar and supported by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Sustained over 10 years, its first diplomatic outing was in Britain in 1982, followed by US, France, Sweden, the erstwhile USSR, Japan, Germany. Amongst the cultural events, scientific achievements, and other aspects were the Vishwakarma exhibitions that projected the textile arts of the country. These exhibitions and the entire infrastructure that underpinned it were the widest, most in-depth government-supported exercise that had ever been attempted or conceived in the field of textile making. The last comparable attempt was 110 years ago, in 1886, when John Forbes Watson had put together the 700 samples that I have already talked about. However, Forbes Watson had cut up readily available textile samples, whereas the Vishwakarma exercise had worked on locating centers and reviving traditions, each textile being a specially commissioned piece, a testimony that master artisans were just waiting for the right circumstance. These decade-long series of interventions were overseen by Jekar and orchestrated by Martand Singh, its chief designer and director. The financing was from the Government of India's Ministry of Textile. The depth and the quite unprecedented scale that fueled this exercise could only have been borne by government. For beyond financing, it gave access to raw materials, human resources, and opened the doors of officialdom. The range of block printed and painted textiles that emerged from these exhibitions was breathtaking. From the renewal of and translation of the temple canopies and thambus of Shikanayakan Pet into saris for the first time, to the floral motif directory of Sanganer and Pethapur, the double-sided print of Bagru in Rajasthan, to the revival of the Kodali Karpur sari in Tamil Nadu. The list of textile techniques and traditions addressed go on. Altering of traditional layouts and compositions, varying color and textures, translated into a new vocabulary of contemporary block prints that emerged from these centers. block prints were transformed into products from fashion to home furnishing to wall hangings, giving them a new lease of life. Aimed on the one hand at the emerging urban markets in India and the educated professional who saw in such products a new identity for modern India. Their formats of major international exhibitions, on the other hand, led designers and design companies to discover a new resource for their collections. As a result, a new ecology of professional block printers, dyers, and pigment printers came up, connected to buyers in India and overseas. The ecology included designers, exporters, and in time, the growth of entrepreneurial activity, whether in small ateliers or at the grassroots, for the design and production of block prints for contemporary markets. There was also infrastructure developed by government through a parallel exercise of setting up state emporiums to bring the best of regional textiles and decorative arts to major cities and the growing metropolitan population. At a time when Indians were not as mobile as they are today, this plan translated a far-sighted banking of urban acceptance of contemporarized village crafts. The formula for success was based on designers who worked with craftspeople, transforming what was essentially village wear into products for an urban milieu. The emporiums that stood out for me were Lepakshi, representing Andhra, Gurjari from Gujarat, to Mrigneni from Madhya Pradesh. The transfer of block prints like Ajrak, Nalia, and other traditions, customarily worn by agriculturalists and pastoralists as lungis, shoulder cloths, and gathered long skirts, into urban textiles. The tie-dye shawl, sized down from its original head covering orni, into a city accessory. The shifting from wool to cotton, allowing for year-long wearing. The easy accessibility of block prints of the Masolipatnam and Bagh were only some of the many transformations. Outside of direct government support, analogous developments were taking place, and a new generation of activists in pan India and regional NGOs responded to the shifts in circumstances confronting the craftspeople, empowering and creating sustainable economic models, fulfilling development agendas from collectivization, self-sufficiency, and social equity. Simultaneously, design pioneers working with the crafts served as a bridge, mediating between craftspeople and their evolving urban markets. Locating old disused blocks, researching museum collections, developing new layouts and compositions, experimenting with forgotten tones and shades, to finding new markets and customers. From Shona Ray, who introduced craft into people's interiors, Prabhaben Shah and Malti Jhaveri, sisters who worked in the 50s and 60s, Sina Kaul to Ratna Fabri, and Nelly Setna, who in 1970 worked with the fading Masolipatnam Kalamkari hand block prints and the Sri Kalahasti narrative textile scroll paintings. Riten Majumdar, whose dramatic patterning and minimal color palette for home and apparel, to Bridget Singh in Jaipur, who has produced fine quality block prints reminiscent of Mughal textiles from 1984. Design graduates and increasing emphasis of design in block printing was also an outcome of the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and the building of the many NIFTs from 1986 onwards, and the many other institutions that have changed forever the design landscape in India. And a small, though extremely significant transformation in 2005 when Judy Frater founded the first institution of design for traditional artisans in Kutch, Kala Raksha Vidyalaya, and the 2015 setup of the Somaya Kala Vidya, seeding the next generation, students of design, whether formal or informal, innovating and pushing boundaries, experimenting with their traditions, with business cards that read artisan designer. From Dheeraj Chippa in Bagru, Khushiram Pandey in Sanganer, Bilal Khatri in Bagh, and in Ajrakpur, we have Sufyan and Junaid Khatri, amongst many others. At the core, of course, is the incredible lineup of those whose tenacity has carried forward the tradition, whose virtuoso ingenuousness and versatility lies in applying literally proto-historic techniques to a contemporary sensibility. The roll of honor is long, but it delights me that they are no longer anonymous. From Dr. Ismail Khatri, Jabbar Khatri, Irfan Anwar Khatri, and others in Ajrakpur and Dhamarka. In Bagh, the late Ismail Suleiman Khatri and his extended family, and Haji Ibrahim Khatri and his family. The late Gurappa Chetty, his son Niranjan Chetty in Srikalahasti. The late Rashid Bhai's family in Jaipur. Brij Ballabh Udewal and Vikram Joshi in Sanganer. Ramesh Dosaya, Ram Kishore Derawala and Bagru, Yasin Trabuddin Chipa and Pipar, Ranamal Khatri and Barmer, Ishwar Adu and others in Polavaram and Perna, Khatri Firoz Rangrez in Ahmedabad, and right here in Mumbai, we have the family of Ahmed Khatri of Prachin, and the list goes on. And long may they thrive in their continuing impact in our interconnected and interdependent world. In the backdrop of the 1991 government policy of economic liberalization and deregulated markets, with economic growth and growing disposable income, a fashion-hungry customer meshed with an emerging ferment in the design space, the mushrooming of the big fat Indian wedding, Shushmita Sen's 1994 win of the Miss Universal contest, marked the coming of the age of ramp shows and a focus of change on craft, block print, and innovation. The cross-pollination ferment of all these influences and impacts and more have led to this point, with a seamless linking of an entire ecosystem of design and designers, retailers with block printers and dyers, to innovation, to curation, to commercial potential, and to the contemporary. Today, there is a growing recognition in our speeded up world that the slow and the handmade is the true luxury. Knowing who printed the cloth you wore, the colors they have used, their lineage, the lineage it belongs to, and making each textile a valued product. Block prints continue to be desired, and the skill of the printer can be seen from everyday fashion to elite designer wear to the global markets, creating afterlives with semiotics, or what can now be considered as a contemporary language of Indian textiles. These and the many other successes that time constraints do not permit demonstrate the versatility inherent in the block printing ecology that has allowed for continuous innovation and making. Yet, while we in India have experienced perhaps the world's largest effort at integrating traditional textiles with new product development, it is in the very nature of existence that futures will always be challenged. There can be no resting on laurels, as given unstoppable change, the ongoing task of keeping pace with an Indian modernity remains unfinished. Altering semiotics, shifting sensibilities, variable markets will continue to challenge textile futures. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. Within 1 hour, you've taken us to about 300 years of the textile history. And thank you so much for the Vishwakarma. It brought back so many memories. I think it started in Cross Maidan and then eventually shifted to Bandra Reclamation, which was my first exposure towards actual weaving to see it in Mumbai. Why do you think it stopped? And my other question is about your first slide, which shows Ramesses II in British Museum with Ajrak prints. So those are Ajrak prints because some of the scholars believe that they are not Ajrak prints, which has been classified by many scholars. So what is your take on that?
Okay, I'll start with the first part of your question. Why did it stop? I think in the 1990s, when India liberalized, government's gaze turned away. It turned to industrialization, digitization, and economic growth. And this sector became what they have often termed as a sunset industry. So it was a place where it didn't resonate any longer. But at the same time, I feel that the wonderful thing was it had caught fire. And that is why it was the start of NID, NIFT, designers, students, private entrepreneurs, and government continues to have schemes, but I'm so delighted that it has entered an area of entrepreneurship because at the end, every block printer is an entrepreneur. He makes to sell and he or she improves, innovates for a larger market, whether it be a museum or elite luxury group or someone like you and me and someone, a student. So I feel that government's priorities change, but like I said, look at how we are all dressed. I mean, how many of us are wearing kurta pajamas and saris? How remarkable is this textile revolution? How many of us are wearing jeans and shirts and yet they're block printed or woven? So you see, the Indian populace is interested in their own culture and history. So we have taken over. So I think that's great. And about classification, that's such a complicated question because I'm actually working on a book on Kasuti at the moment. And I think while we look at the classification of the acquisitions in the museum and we say, oh, this is wrong, but the fact is, then write to them, explain to them why it's wrong, so that if it's a scholarly response, there is no reason why they will not respond. Because in fact, while searching for Kasuti online, I found 2 that had been mislabeled. So it's part of my essay saying, hey, this is actually the first Kasuti I've ever seen because it's dated so far back, but no one else has found it because it was mislabeled. So it was good that we found it, and now hopefully it will be relabeled because they are one of the largest collection of South Asian textiles and other products in the world, so I'm sure there will be some mislabeling.
Yeah. Thank you for that wonderful talk. What is your comments on technology? Because technology displaces artisans and makes things cheaper for the mass market. And how was that played out even after independence? So what are your views on that?
This was something I just didn't want to touch on because it's a lecture on its own. But since you asked, technology is essential. Almost every craftsperson, weaver I know is now on WhatsApp. They are sending you pictures, they are getting you orders, they have Paytm, and they are connecting to the wider market. Everybody, by and large, has electricity. All that is, we don't even consider that technology anymore. They have computers, they are seeing designs, they are becoming designers themselves. Even located in their little villages, they are able to see what is doing very well anywhere where their markets are. But yes, it is a huge issue of faking and copying and misappropriation of their products. And the same thing that is copied on silkscreen, it's copied on digital prints, and I have several issues with this. But like I said, it's a very complicated thing, and I don't want to stir a hornet's nest because it's actually a very long discussion. But first of all, in India, we have the GI Act, which can be used for the arts and crafts. And I think there are about, I just had the figures, but I've forgotten. I think there are over 360 GIs been given, of which over 60% are in the crafts and textiles. But that has to follow a certain process. Now, the problem also is, and I don't want to be quoted on this, is often in their hurry to produce, weavers and craftspeople themselves do take shortcuts. Now, I feel at the end, as a customer, I will buy, if I cannot afford a weave, I'm very happy to buy something made on a palloon, but tell me it is made on a palloon. If it is silk-screened, tell me it is silk-screened. But, so that is one aspect. The other aspect is when products are of living artisans like ajrak are replicated on palloon and other things. Again, this is so nuanced. Yes, it is very easy to say it's completely wrong. But I have a small story to tell you. When I was last in Kutch, the pastoralists and others continue to wear their head cover, their shoulder cloth of ajrak, but they cannot afford the block printed ajrak. So in the Kutch market, in the local Bhuj market, you will find cloth that is sold specifically for them because they want to wear what is of their custom and their tradition. So to them, it doesn't matter that it hasn't been block printed in this long 17-step process. So, like I said, this is a seminar of its own. So,
Okay, one
yes.
last question we can take.
What effort is being put to make the industry sustainable, in terms of chemicals and also livelihood? These are things that bother all of us today.
It's a really big bother because for fast production, you cannot use natural dyes. And if it follows the traditional process, it does involve repeated washings in the river. So the rivers do flow red and blue and pink. And there are people, and in fact, Ajrakpur is also a great example where they have set up effluent plants. And they're not huge effluent plants, they're small effluent plants where they wash within their area and the water is recycled. It can't be used for drinking, but I myself have seen the water and it's completely clear and it can be used for plants and other things. So that is the effort that has to be made, that you must set up effluent plants in the clusters, make the technology cheap so that, and also it also depends on all of us. It depends on the big buyers to say, we are happy if you increase your price. We will help you, give you a loan, set up your effluent plant. We will wait to give you orders. So actually the push has to come from many directions because it's easy for all of us to continue what we are doing. Unless a very big buyer says, no more orders from tomorrow, set up a plant. And I would do it in 24 hours if this threat hung over my head.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ritu. Thank you.
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.